Question 1. Quality control measures reveal potential inefficiencies in Globant's client onboarding process. To address this, a team proposes analyzing historical client data to identify bottlenecks. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for process improvement with regulatory compliance and ethical data handling? Option A. Analyze only a small, randomly selected sample of client data, assuming this will be sufficient to identify general trends without needing further review. Option B. Immediately grant the team broad access to all historical client data to allow for unrestricted exploration and identification of all potential issues. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive data impact assessment to identify sensitive data, define the scope of analysis, and implement appropriate anonymization and security measures before proceeding with data extraction and analysis. Option D. Proceed with analyzing all client data, focusing solely on operational metrics and disregarding any personal identifiable information that might be present. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive data impact assessment to identify sensitive data, define the scope of analysis, and implement appropriate anonymization and security measures before proceeding with data extraction and analysis. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Globant, as a technology services company, handles sensitive client data. Ensuring the integrity and confidentiality of this data is paramount, not only for maintaining client trust and business relationships, but also for adhering to data protection regulations. The challenge lies in balancing the need for internal quality control and process improvement with the strict requirements of data privacy and security. A hasty or overly broad approach to data analysis could inadvertently lead to breaches or noncompliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough impact assessment before any data analysis is undertaken. This assessment would meticulously identify the specific data involved, its sensitivity, the purpose of the analysis, and the potential risks associated with accessing and processing it. It would then define appropriate safeguards, such as anonymization, pseudonymization, access controls, and secure processing environments, to mitigate these risks. This aligns with the principles of data minimization and privacy by design, which are fundamental to data protection regulations like GDPR, if applicable to the exam's jurisdiction, otherwise refer to the specific exam's jurisdiction's data protection laws. The impact assessment ensures that Globant's actions are compliant, ethical, and minimize potential harm to individuals whose data is being analyzed, thereby upholding professional responsibility and regulatory adherence. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing a blanket data access policy without prior assessment is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It disregards the principle of data minimization, potentially exposing sensitive information unnecessarily. This approach risks violating data protection laws by processing data without a clear, legitimate purpose or adequate safeguards. Conducting analysis on a limited, arbitrary subset of data without understanding its representativeness or potential biases is also problematic. While seemingly a risk reduction measure, it can lead to flawed conclusions and ineffective quality improvements, undermining the very purpose of the assessment. Furthermore, if this limited subset still contains sensitive information, the lack of a comprehensive impact assessment means potential privacy risks remain unaddressed. Ignoring the need for anonymization or pseudonymization for any data that could identify individuals is a direct contravention of data privacy principles. Even if the analysis is for internal quality control, the processing of personal data must be done in a way that protects the rights and freedoms of individuals. This approach creates a high risk of data breaches and noncompliance with data protection legislation. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Globant should adopt a risk-based approach to data handling. This involves understanding the data landscape, identifying potential risks to data privacy and security, and implementing proportionate controls. Before any data analysis, a formal impact assessment process should be initiated. This process should involve relevant stakeholders, including legal, compliance, and IT security teams, to ensure all regulatory and ethical considerations are addressed. The decision-making framework should prioritize compliance, data protection, and the minimization of harm to individuals, ensuring that business objectives are pursued responsibly. Question 2. Research into Globant's data handling practices reveals a need to ensure compliance with diverse international data protection regulations, which approach best safeguards Globant's operations and client data while adhering to the highest ethical and legal standards. Option A. Comply only with the minimum data protection requirements stipulated by the least stringent jurisdiction where Globant operates. Option B. Rely exclusively on client-provided data protection policies for each project, without independent verification or integration into Globant's overarching data governance framework. Option C. Implement data protection measures that align with the most stringent data privacy regulations applicable to Globant's operations or client data, regardless of the specific jurisdiction of a particular project. Option D. Adopt a flexible approach where data protection measures are adjusted based on the perceived risk of a data breach for each individual client, rather than a standardized compliance framework. The correct answer is C. Implement data protection measures that align with the most stringent data privacy regulations applicable to Globant's operations or client data, regardless of the specific jurisdiction of a particular project. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Globant, as a global technology company, must navigate varying data privacy regulations across different jurisdictions where it operates and serves clients. The core difficulty lies in ensuring compliance with the most stringent applicable data protection laws, even when local or client-specific requirements might be less demanding. This requires a proactive and comprehensive approach to data governance, rather than a reactive or minimal compliance strategy. Careful judgment is required to balance business needs with robust data protection principles. The correct approach involves adopting a privacy by design and privacy by default methodology, and adhering to the highest common denominator of data protection standards across all relevant jurisdictions. This means implementing data protection measures that meet or exceed the requirements of the most rigorous regulations Globant is subject to, such as GDPR if applicable to its operations or client data. This approach ensures that Globant's data handling practices are consistently robust, minimizing the risk of breaches and regulatory penalties. It aligns with ethical principles of data stewardship and demonstrates a commitment to client trust and data security, which is often a competitive advantage. An incorrect approach would be to only comply with the minimum data protection requirements of the least stringent jurisdiction. This is professionally unacceptable because it exposes Globant to significant legal and reputational risks in jurisdictions with stricter laws. It fails to uphold the ethical obligation to protect data adequately, regardless of the lowest common denominator. Such an approach could lead to substantial fines, loss of client business, and damage to Globant's brand. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on client-provided data protection policies without independent verification or integration into Globant's own robust framework. While client policies are important, they may not always reflect the full scope of Globant's legal obligations or best practices. This can create gaps in compliance and leave Globant vulnerable if client policies are inadequate or if Globant's own responsibilities extend beyond what the client's policy covers. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of all applicable data protection laws and regulations relevant to Globant's operations and client base. This includes identifying the most stringent requirements and building internal policies and procedures that consistently meet or exceed these standards. Regular audits, employee training, and a commitment to continuous improvement in data privacy practices are essential. When in doubt, seeking legal counsel specializing in data privacy is a prudent step. Question 3. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a candidate being interviewed for a critical role at Globant has a close personal relationship with a senior manager within the same department. The hiring manager is aware of this relationship and is considering proceeding with the interview without any further action, believing they can remain objective. What is the most appropriate course of action for the hiring manager to take? Option A. Ignore the relationship and proceed with the interview, assuming it will not impact the assessment or the candidate's chances. Option B. Proceed with the interview as planned, trusting their ability to remain objective and not let the personal relationship influence their decision. Option C. Discuss the situation with the senior manager and ask them to discreetly advocate for the candidate's suitability during internal discussions. Option D. Immediately escalate the situation to Globant's compliance or HR department for guidance and to ensure the integrity of the hiring process. The correct answer is D. Immediately escalate the situation to Globant's compliance or HR department for guidance and to ensure the integrity of the hiring process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Globant to navigate a situation where a potential conflict of interest could arise, impacting the integrity of Globant's hiring process and its commitment to fair and objective evaluation. The need for careful judgment stems from the obligation to uphold Globant's ethical standards and regulatory compliance, ensuring that all candidates are assessed on merit and that no undue influence is exerted. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the situation to the appropriate internal compliance or HR department. This is the right course of action because it adheres to established corporate governance principles and potential regulatory frameworks that mandate reporting of conflicts of interest or situations that could compromise fairness. By escalating, the individual ensures that a neutral, authorized body within Globant can investigate, assess the risk, and implement appropriate measures to maintain the integrity of the hiring process. This proactive step demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence, protecting Globant from potential reputational damage and legal repercussions. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the interview without disclosing the relationship. This fails to acknowledge the potential for bias, even if unintentional, and violates the principle of objective assessment. It could lead to a perception of favoritism, undermining the credibility of the hiring process and potentially violating internal Globant policies designed to prevent conflicts of interest. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the situation with the candidate's relative who is a Globant employee and ask them to influence the outcome. This is ethically reprehensible and likely violates numerous corporate policies and potentially regulatory guidelines related to undue influence and bribery. It directly introduces bias and compromises the fairness of the assessment, exposing Globant to significant risk. A further incorrect approach would be to ignore the situation and proceed with the interview as if no relationship existed, hoping that no bias would manifest. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to proactively manage risk. It places the individual in a position of potential compromise and leaves Globant vulnerable to accusations of unfair hiring practices, even if no actual bias occurred. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of Globant's code of conduct and conflict of interest policies. When a potential conflict is identified, the immediate step should be to cease any direct involvement that could be perceived as biased and to report the situation through the designated internal channels. This ensures that the matter is handled by those with the authority and responsibility to do so, maintaining transparency and fairness throughout the process. Question 4. Comparative studies suggest that technology consulting firms like Globant often face complex client demands. Imagine a scenario where a key client of Globant, operating within the financial services sector, requests that certain revenue figures for a past quarter be presented in a way that, while not explicitly fraudulent, significantly inflates the perceived performance by selectively highlighting favorable data points and downplaying less favorable ones, without full disclosure of the context. The client argues this is necessary for investor relations. As a Globant consultant working on this project, what is the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Politely but firmly explain to the client that the requested presentation method would misrepresent the financial performance and is not compliant with applicable accounting standards and data integrity principles, and offer to work with them to present the data accurately and transparently, including relevant context. Option B. Proceed with the client's requested presentation method, as the client is ultimately responsible for their investor relations and the request is not explicitly illegal. Option C. Attempt to rephrase the data and accompanying narrative to create the impression of stronger performance, using creative language that avoids outright falsehoods but still achieves the client's desired perception. Option D. Immediately refuse to work on the presentation, citing ethical concerns, without offering any alternative solutions or explanations to the client. The correct answer is A. Politely but firmly explain to the client that the requested presentation method would misrepresent the financial performance and is not compliant with applicable accounting standards and data integrity principles, and offer to work with them to present the data accurately and transparently, including relevant context. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Globant employee due to the inherent conflict between client demands and ethical/regulatory obligations. The need to balance client satisfaction with the integrity of financial reporting and compliance with relevant regulations requires careful judgment. Globant, as a service provider, must ensure its employees understand and adhere to the regulatory framework governing financial reporting and data handling, even when faced with pressure from a client. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, which in this context would be the specific accounting standards and data privacy laws applicable to the client's operations and Globant services. This approach prioritizes accurate and compliant financial reporting, even if it means pushing back against a client's potentially misleading requests. The justification lies in upholding professional integrity, preventing misrepresentation of financial data, and avoiding potential legal and reputational damage for both Globant and its client. Adherence to accounting principles and data protection regulations is paramount. An incorrect approach that involves directly acceding to the client's request without proper scrutiny would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for accounting standards, which mandate truthful and accurate financial representation. It also risks violating data privacy regulations if sensitive client data is mishandled or misrepresented. Another incorrect approach, that of simply refusing the client without offering a compliant alternative, could damage the client relationship and fail to address the underlying need for accurate reporting. While maintaining integrity is crucial, a collaborative approach that seeks to find a compliant solution is often preferred. A third incorrect approach, which involves attempting to reinterpret existing data to fit the client's narrative, is a form of misrepresentation and violates the core ethical duty of honesty in financial reporting. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue and the relevant regulatory and ethical obligations. This involves consulting internal policies, accounting standards, and applicable laws. If there is ambiguity or pressure to deviate, seeking guidance from senior management, legal counsel, or compliance officers is essential. The goal is to find a solution that is both compliant and addresses the client's underlying business needs, fostering trust through transparency and adherence to professional standards. Question 5. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood and moderate impact score for a potential data breach due to an unpatched legacy system in Globant's development environment, and a moderate likelihood and high impact score for a sudden regulatory change in a key client's operating jurisdiction that could affect service delivery. Which approach best aligns with Globant's risk management responsibilities? Option A. Allocate resources equally to both risks, as both present significant threats to Globant. Option B. Prioritize immediate patching of the legacy system, as it has the highest overall risk score on the matrix. Option C. Focus mitigation efforts on the potential regulatory change, as its high impact could have more significant long-term consequences for Globant's client relationships and market access. Option D. Defer action on the legacy system until a critical vulnerability is exploited, and monitor the regulatory landscape passively. The correct answer is B. Prioritize immediate patching of the legacy system, as it has the highest overall risk score on the matrix. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because Globant, as a technology services company, operates in a dynamic environment where new risks emerge constantly. The risk matrix, a standard tool for risk assessment, helps prioritize these risks, but its interpretation requires careful judgment to ensure that mitigation strategies are proportionate and effective, aligning with both regulatory expectations and business objectives. The challenge lies in moving beyond a purely quantitative assessment to a qualitative understanding of impact and likelihood, especially when dealing with emerging threats like sophisticated cyber attacks or regulatory changes in new markets. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of the identified risks, considering their potential impact on Globant's operations, reputation, and financial stability, and then prioritizing mitigation efforts based on this holistic assessment. This aligns with general principles of good corporate governance and risk management, which emphasize proactive identification and management of significant risks. Specifically, regulatory frameworks often mandate that companies have robust risk management systems in place to protect client data, ensure business continuity, and comply with data privacy laws. A thorough review ensures that Globant's response is not only compliant but also strategically sound, focusing resources on the most critical threats. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the highest numerical scores on the risk matrix, without considering the qualitative context. This could lead to overinvesting in mitigating low-impact, high-probability risks, while neglecting high-impact, lower-probability risks that could have catastrophic consequences for Globant. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore risks that fall outside the immediate operational scope, such as reputational risks stemming from social media sentiment or geopolitical instability affecting client operations. Regulatory bodies expect companies to consider a broad spectrum of risks, not just those that are easily quantifiable or directly operational. Failing to do so can result in non-compliance and significant penalties. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the business context and strategic objectives of Globant. This involves not just identifying risks, but also understanding their root causes and potential cascading effects. The risk matrix should serve as a guide, not a definitive dictator. A critical step is to involve relevant stakeholders from different departments, e.g., legal, IT security, operations, client management, to gain diverse perspectives on risk impact and mitigation feasibility. This collaborative approach ensures that the chosen mitigation strategies are practical, cost-effective, and aligned with the company's overall risk appetite and regulatory obligations. Question 6. Regulatory review indicates that Globant is planning to implement a new client onboarding process that will involve the collection and processing of a wider range of sensitive client data than previously handled. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with data protection regulations and ethical data handling practices? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive data protection impact assessment (DPIA) to identify and mitigate potential privacy risks before full implementation. Option B. Perform a brief, informal review of the process, focusing only on preventing obvious data breaches. Option C. Proceed with the new onboarding process, relying on existing general data protection policies to govern data handling. Option D. Assign the sole responsibility for ensuring data privacy compliance to the IT department, with minimal input from other business units. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive data protection impact assessment (DPIA) to identify and mitigate potential privacy risks before full implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in compliance and risk management within a technology services company like Globant. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for efficient data processing and client service with the stringent requirements of data privacy regulations. Globant, operating in a global market, must navigate a complex web of international and local data protection laws. The challenge is amplified when dealing with sensitive client data, where a misstep can lead to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all data handling practices are not only legally compliant, but also ethically sound, reflecting Globant's commitment to its clients and regulatory bodies. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive data privacy impact assessment (DPIA) before the new client onboarding process is fully implemented. This assessment would systematically identify potential risks to data privacy associated with the proposed data processing activities, evaluate the necessity and proportionality of these activities, and determine appropriate safeguards to mitigate identified risks. This aligns with the principles of data protection by design and by default, which are fundamental to many modern privacy regulations. By conducting a DPIA, Globant demonstrates a commitment to understanding and addressing privacy concerns upfront, ensuring that the new process is built on a foundation of compliance and risk mitigation. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining regulatory adherence and client confidence. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the new onboarding process without a formal risk assessment, assuming existing general data protection policies are sufficient. This fails to acknowledge that specific client data and processing activities may introduce novel or heightened privacy risks that require tailored mitigation strategies. Relying on general policies without a specific assessment is a regulatory failure, as it bypasses a key requirement for understanding and managing data protection risks, particularly when dealing with new or significantly altered data processing operations. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial review of the process, focusing only on obvious data breaches and overlooking more subtle privacy infringements or non-compliance with specific consent or data subject rights requirements. This approach is ethically and regulatorily deficient because it does not provide a thorough evaluation of all potential privacy impacts. It risks overlooking critical aspects of data protection, such as data minimization, purpose limitation, or the lawful basis for processing, leading to potential breaches of privacy principles and regulatory violations. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to delegate the entire responsibility for data privacy compliance to the IT department, without adequate oversight or input from legal and compliance teams. While IT plays a crucial role in implementing technical safeguards, data privacy is a broader legal and ethical concern that requires expertise from various departments. This siloed approach can lead to a lack of understanding of the full regulatory landscape and potential business implications, resulting in non-compliance and increased risk. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk-based approach. First, identify the relevant data protection regulations applicable to the specific client and data. Second, conduct a thorough assessment of the proposed data processing activities, including data flows, types of data, and potential impacts on individuals. Third, consult with legal and compliance experts to interpret regulatory requirements and identify potential risks. Fourth, implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to mitigate identified risks and ensure compliance. Finally, establish ongoing monitoring and review mechanisms to adapt to evolving regulatory landscapes and business practices. Question 7. Consider a scenario where Globant is tasked with migrating a significant volume of sensitive client data to a new cloud-based platform. The project timeline is extremely aggressive, and the client is emphasizing rapid deployment. A junior project manager suggests bypassing the standard security review and data privacy impact assessment processes to meet the deadline, arguing that the client is eager to go live. Which of the following approaches best reflects Globant's professional and regulatory obligations in this situation? Option A. Halt the migration and inform the client that the security review and data privacy impact assessment must be completed before any data transfer can occur, proposing a revised timeline that accommodates these essential steps. Option B. Expedite the security review and impact assessment by only focusing on the most critical data elements, assuming that less sensitive data can be addressed post-migration. Option C. Proceed with the data migration immediately to meet the client's deadline, deferring the security review and impact assessment until after the initial deployment. Option D. Rely on the client's general consent for data handling and proceed with the migration, assuming they have reviewed and approved the security implications of the new platform. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the data migration immediately to meet the client's deadline, deferring the security review and impact assessment until after the initial deployment. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because Globant, as a technology services company, operates in a highly regulated environment where data privacy and security are paramount. The pressure to deliver a project quickly can create a conflict between speed and adherence to established compliance protocols. Careful judgment is required to balance business objectives with legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough risk assessment and the implementation of appropriate security controls before data migration. This aligns with the principles of data protection by design and by default, which are fundamental in many regulatory frameworks governing data handling. Specifically, it ensures that Globant is proactively identifying and mitigating potential vulnerabilities, thereby safeguarding client data and maintaining trust. This proactive stance is often mandated by regulations that require organizations to implement reasonable security measures to prevent unauthorized access, disclosure, alteration, or destruction of personal data. An incorrect approach that bypasses security reviews to expedite the migration poses significant regulatory and ethical risks. This could lead to data breaches, violating data protection laws such as GDPR, if applicable to the client's data, or similar national regulations. Such a failure would result in severe penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client confidence. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on technical migration without considering data governance and access controls, overlooks the importance of who can access the data and for what purpose. This can lead to unauthorized access and misuse, again contravening data protection principles and potentially leading to legal repercussions. A third incorrect approach, assuming client consent covers all data handling aspects without explicit confirmation, is ethically dubious and legally risky. Consent must be informed and specific, and relying on assumptions can lead to violations if the client's understanding or the scope of consent is misinterpreted. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes compliance and risk management. This involves understanding the relevant regulatory landscape, conducting comprehensive impact assessments, consulting with legal and compliance teams, and ensuring that all processes are documented and auditable. When faced with time pressures, the framework should guide professionals to explore alternative solutions that maintain compliance, such as phased migrations or temporary workarounds, rather than compromising on essential security and legal requirements. Question 8. The efficiency study reveals that Globant could significantly reduce operational costs by streamlining data processing workflows. However, some proposed changes involve sharing certain aggregated client data with third-party analytics providers to identify further optimization opportunities. Considering the Globant hiring assessment tests regulatory framework, which approach should Globant adopt to ensure compliance and ethical conduct? Option A. Implement the efficiency recommendations that do not involve direct client data sharing, and defer any decisions on proposals that require further analysis of data privacy implications. Option B. Proceed with sharing aggregated client data with third-party analytics providers, as recommended by the study, assuming that standard industry data anonymization practices are sufficient to meet regulatory requirements. Option C. Prioritize the cost savings identified in the study and implement the data sharing changes, with a plan to address any potential regulatory issues that may arise retrospectively. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive legal and compliance review of the proposed data sharing mechanisms with third parties, ensuring all data protection regulations and client agreements are strictly adhered to, and obtain explicit client consent where required before any data is shared. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive legal and compliance review of the proposed data sharing mechanisms with third parties, ensuring all data protection regulations and client agreements are strictly adhered to, and obtain explicit client consent where required before any data is shared. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Globant, as a technology services company, must balance the pursuit of operational efficiency with its ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The efficiency study's findings, while potentially beneficial for cost savings and service delivery, could inadvertently lead to practices that compromise data privacy or security, especially when dealing with client data. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any implemented changes adhere strictly to the regulatory framework governing data handling and client confidentiality. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the efficiency study's recommendations by Globant's legal and compliance teams in consultation with relevant stakeholders to ensure alignment with all applicable regulations and ethical standards before implementation. This approach is best professional practice because it prioritizes regulatory adherence and ethical conduct. Specifically, it ensures that Globant does not violate data protection laws e.g. GDPR if applicable to client data, or other relevant data privacy legislation based on the exam's specified jurisdiction, or contractual obligations with clients. This proactive due diligence prevents potential legal repercussions, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. An incorrect approach of immediately implementing the efficiency recommendations without a compliance review would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This bypasses the necessary scrutiny to ensure that proposed efficiency gains do not involve unauthorized data processing, inadequate security measures, or breaches of confidentiality, all of which are typically prohibited by data protection laws and professional codes of conduct. Another incorrect approach of prioritizing cost savings above all else, even if it means potentially overlooking minor regulatory deviations, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a disregard for legal obligations and ethical responsibilities, potentially leading to severe penalties and a breakdown of trust with clients and regulatory bodies. A third incorrect approach of assuming that standard industry practices are sufficient without specific verification against the study's findings and the current regulatory landscape is also flawed. Regulatory environments and best practices evolve, and a blanket assumption can lead to non-compliance if the study's recommendations introduce novel risks or if existing practices are no longer considered adequate. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This framework should include 1. Identifying potential risks associated with the proposed changes, particularly concerning regulatory compliance and ethical considerations. 2. Evaluating the likelihood and impact of these risks. 3. Consulting with legal, compliance, and relevant subject matter experts. 4. Developing mitigation strategies to address identified risks. And 5. Obtaining necessary approvals before proceeding with implementation. This systematic approach ensures that business objectives are pursued responsibly and ethically. Question 9. The investigation demonstrates that a Globant client, seeking to maximize short-term gains, has requested a series of trades that, if executed as described, would appear to artificially influence the price of a particular security. The client believes this strategy will lead to a significant profit before the market corrects itself. Option A. Refuse to execute the trades as requested, citing regulatory prohibitions against market manipulation and offering to discuss alternative compliant investment strategies. Option B. Advise the client on how to structure the trades to minimize the appearance of manipulation while still achieving their desired price impact. Option C. Inform the client that while the requested trades are problematic, Globant can proceed if the client provides a written waiver acknowledging the risks. Option D. Execute the trades as requested by the client, assuming the client is aware of the potential risks and regulatory implications. The correct answer is A. Refuse to execute the trades as requested, citing regulatory prohibitions against market manipulation and offering to discuss alternative, compliant investment strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire for a specific outcome and the regulatory obligation to ensure fair and transparent market practices. Globant, as a financial services firm, must navigate this by prioritizing compliance and ethical conduct over potentially lucrative but non-compliant client requests. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client relationship management with the stringent requirements of regulatory frameworks designed to prevent market manipulation and ensure investor protection. Careful judgment is required to identify and refuse requests that, while seemingly beneficial to an individual client, could undermine market integrity or violate regulatory mandates. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework and its implications for client interactions. Specifically, it requires Globant to identify that the client's request, if acted upon, would constitute a prohibited market practice. The professional and regulatory justification for this approach is rooted in the principles of market integrity and investor protection, which are paramount in financial regulation. By refusing to execute the trade in the manner requested, Globant upholds its duty to comply with regulations, thereby preventing potential legal repercussions, reputational damage, and contributing to a fair and orderly market. This aligns with the overarching goal of financial regulators to maintain confidence in the financial system. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without proper consideration of the regulatory implications. This could manifest as attempting to execute the trade in a way that circumvents established rules, or by providing advice that, while meeting the client's immediate goal, encourages or facilitates a breach of regulations. Such actions would represent a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Specifically, it would violate principles of market abuse prevention, potentially leading to sanctions from regulatory bodies. Furthermore, it would breach the duty of care owed to clients by exposing them to undue risk and potentially illegal activities, and would damage Globant's reputation as a responsible financial institution. Another incorrect approach would be to offer an alternative that, while not directly violating the specific request, still skirts the edges of regulatory compliance or creates a misleading impression for the client. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to the spirit of the regulations, even if the letter is technically avoided. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear, multi-step approach. First, thoroughly understand the client's request and its stated objective. Second, critically assess the request against the applicable regulatory framework, identifying any potential conflicts or prohibited activities. Third, consult internal compliance and legal departments if there is any ambiguity. Fourth, Communicate clearly and professionally with the client, explaining the regulatory constraints and offering compliant alternatives if possible. Finally, document all interactions and decisions meticulously. This structured approach ensures that client needs are considered within the bounds of legal and ethical obligations. Question 10. The analysis reveals that Globant's process optimization team is tasked with enhancing the efficiency of its hiring assessment test. Considering the absolute priority of adhering strictly to the Globant hiring assessment test regulatory framework, which of the following strategies best aligns with these requirements? Option A. Modifying the weighting of existing assessment modules to prioritize certain skills more heavily, based on recent industry trends, without a formal review of the impact on the overall assessment validity as defined by the Globant hiring assessment tests guidelines. Option B. Implementing a new proprietary algorithm for candidate scoring that was developed internally and has shown promising preliminary results in pilot testing, without seeking formal approval against the existing assessment framework. Option C. Streamlining the pre-assessment candidate communication workflow by automating personalized email reminders and providing clearer instructions on test day logistics, ensuring all core assessment content and evaluation criteria remain unchanged. Option D. Introducing a series of challenging, real-time problem-solving simulations that were not part of the original assessment design to better gauge candidate adaptability under pressure. The correct answer is B. Implementing a new proprietary algorithm for candidate scoring that was developed internally and has shown promising preliminary results in pilot testing, without seeking formal approval against the existing assessment framework. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Globant's process optimization team as they aim to improve efficiency while ensuring compliance with the Globant hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework. The core challenge lies in balancing the drive for innovation and speed with the absolute necessity of adhering to the established assessment guidelines, which are paramount for fair and consistent evaluation. Misinterpreting or deviating from these guidelines, even with the intention of optimization, can lead to invalid assessment outcomes, potential legal challenges, and damage to Globant's reputation as a fair employer. Careful judgment is required to identify improvements that enhance process flow without compromising the integrity of the assessment. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to the Globant hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, focusing on optimizing within its defined parameters. This means identifying bottlenecks or inefficiencies in the current assessment process that can be streamlined without altering the core assessment criteria, question types, or evaluation rubrics. For example, improving the user interface for test takers or automating the initial screening of certain objective responses, provided these optimizations do not impact the assessment's validity or fairness, would be compliant. This approach is correct because it prioritizes the integrity and fairness of the assessment, which is the fundamental requirement of any hiring assessment test. It upholds the principle of equal opportunity by ensuring all candidates are evaluated under the same, predefined, and compliant conditions. An incorrect approach would be to introduce new assessment methodologies or significantly alter the scoring mechanisms without explicit approval or alignment with the Globant hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. For instance, implementing a new, unvalidated psychometric tool or changing the weighting of existing assessment components would be a regulatory failure. This is because the Globant hiring assessment tests framework likely specifies the approved assessment tools and evaluation criteria. Deviating from these without proper validation and authorization undermines the test's reliability and validity, potentially leading to biased hiring decisions. Another incorrect approach would be to bypass established review and approval processes for any proposed optimization. This constitutes an ethical and procedural failure, as it disregards the governance structure designed to ensure compliance and prevent unintended negative consequences. Such actions could be seen as an attempt to circumvent oversight, which is unprofessional and risky. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the governing regulatory framework. Before proposing any optimization, professionals must thoroughly review and comprehend the specific rules, guidelines, and objectives of the assessment. They should then identify potential areas for improvement that are clearly within the scope of these regulations. Any proposed changes should be documented, including a clear rationale and an assessment of their impact on fairness and validity. Crucially, proposed optimizations must be submitted for review and approval through the established channels, ensuring that compliance with the Globant hiring assessment test's regulatory framework is verified by the appropriate stakeholders. This systematic approach ensures that process optimization efforts are both effective and compliant. Question 11. The evaluation methodology shows that a Globant client, operating within a jurisdiction with strict data protection laws similar to GDPR, has requested access to detailed, personally identifiable information of end users who interacted with a specific feature of their product. The client believes this data is crucial for a marketing campaign. Globant's internal data privacy policy strictly prohibits the sharing of personally identifiable end-user data without explicit consent for such a purpose, and the client has not obtained this consent. The project manager at Globant is under pressure from the client to provide the data immediately to meet a tight marketing deadline. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Globant project manager? Option A. Explain to the client that the request cannot be fulfilled as it violates data privacy regulations and Globant's internal policies, and offer to explore alternative, anonymized data insights or aggregated trend analysis that can support their marketing objectives without compromising user privacy. Option B. Proceed with providing the requested personally identifiable end-user data to the client, emphasizing that it is a one-time exception to meet a critical client deadline, and that the client should ensure their own compliance. Option C. Attempt to anonymize the data in a superficial manner, removing obvious identifiers but retaining enough detail to be useful for the client's campaign, and provide it with a disclaimer. Option D. Inform the client that Globant cannot fulfill the request and advise them to seek the data independently from their end users, without offering any further assistance or alternative solutions. The correct answer is A. Explain to the client that the request cannot be fulfilled as it violates data privacy regulations and Globant's internal policies, and offer to explore alternative, anonymized data insights or aggregated trend analysis that can support their marketing objectives without compromising user privacy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Globant employee due to the inherent conflict between client demands and ethical data handling principles, particularly concerning the use of sensitive client information. The need to balance client satisfaction with regulatory compliance and internal Globant policies requires careful judgment and a robust understanding of data privacy. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to Globant's data privacy policies and relevant regulations, even when faced with client pressure. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and legal compliance, safeguarding both the client's data and Globant's reputation. Specifically, it requires understanding and applying principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, and secure data handling as mandated by data protection laws and Globant's internal guidelines. This approach ensures that data is processed only for legitimate, specified purposes and with appropriate security measures, preventing unauthorized access or misuse. An incorrect approach that involves directly sharing the requested sensitive client data without proper anonymization or consent would violate data privacy regulations and Globant's ethical standards. This could lead to severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and a breach of trust with the client. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to fulfill the request by fabricating or inferring data, is unethical and misleading, undermining the integrity of Globant services and potentially creating inaccurate insights for the client. Finally, ignoring the client's request entirely without offering alternative, compliant solutions would be unprofessional and could damage the client relationship, failing to address the client's underlying need in a responsible manner. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core request and its potential implications. This involves consulting relevant internal policies, legal counsel if necessary, and understanding the specific data privacy regulations applicable to the client's jurisdiction and the data itself. The next step is to assess the feasibility and legality of the request. If the request is problematic, the professional should proactively communicate the limitations and propose compliant alternatives that still aim to meet the client's objectives. This proactive and transparent communication, coupled with a strong ethical compass, is crucial for navigating such challenging situations. Question 12. To address the challenge of streamlining the employee onboarding process at Globant while ensuring strict adherence to data privacy regulations, Which of the following approaches best balances efficiency with the protection of sensitive personal information? Option A. Develop an onboarding system that grants all HR personnel unrestricted access to all collected employee data to facilitate quick information retrieval. Option B. Implement a phased data collection and verification strategy, gathering only necessary information at each stage of onboarding and ensuring secure storage and access controls. Option C. Rely exclusively on employee self-attestation for all sensitive data points during onboarding, without any independent verification mechanisms. Option D. Collect all required personal and sensitive data from every new employee at the very beginning of the onboarding process, irrespective of their immediate role or access requirements. The correct answer is B. Implement a phased data collection and verification strategy, gathering only necessary information at each stage of onboarding and ensuring secure storage and access controls. Explanation. Scenario analysis. Globant, as a technology services company, operates in a highly regulated environment where data privacy and security are paramount. The challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient internal processes, such as onboarding new employees, with the strict legal and ethical obligations to protect sensitive personal information. Failure to adhere to these obligations can result in significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. This scenario demands careful judgment to ensure that process optimization does not inadvertently compromise compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves implementing a phased data collection and verification process that aligns with data minimization principles and relevant privacy regulations. This means collecting only the data strictly necessary for each stage of the onboarding process and ensuring that data is securely stored and accessed. For instance, initial onboarding might only require basic identification, with more sensitive information collected and verified later, once the employee has a legitimate need for access to specific systems or data. This approach directly addresses the regulatory requirement to process personal data lawfully, fairly, and transparently, and to ensure data is adequate, relevant, and not excessive in relation to the purposes for which it is processed. It also aligns with the principle of data minimization, a cornerstone of many data protection frameworks, by avoiding the unnecessary collection and storage of sensitive information upfront. Incorrect approach is analysis. Collecting all required personal and sensitive data upfront from every new employee, regardless of their immediate role or access needs, represents a failure to adhere to the principle of data minimization. This practice increases the risk of data breaches by holding a larger volume of sensitive information than is immediately necessary, and it can be seen as excessive processing under data protection laws. Implementing a system that allows broad access to all collected employee data by any member of the HR department without a clear business need or role-based access controls is a significant security and privacy failure. This violates principles of data security and confidentiality, as it increases the likelihood of unauthorized access, misuse, or disclosure of personal information. Relying solely on employee self-attestation for all sensitive data points without any form of verification or validation, especially for critical information, can lead to inaccuracies and potential compliance issues. While self-attestation can be part of a process, a complete lack of verification for all sensitive data points may not meet the due diligence requirements for accurate record keeping and compliance with certain regulatory obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Globant should adopt a risk-based and compliance-first mindset when optimizing processes. This involves 1. Identifying all applicable regulatory requirements related to data privacy and employee onboarding. 2. Mapping the data lifecycle for employee onboarding, from collection to storage and eventual deletion. 3. Applying the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation to each stage. 4. Implementing robust security measures and access controls based on the principle of least privilege. 5. Regularly reviewing and auditing processes to ensure ongoing compliance and identify areas for improvement. 6. Prioritizing the protection of personal data as a core ethical and legal responsibility. Question 13. The review process indicates that during a Globant hiring assessment test, a candidate encountered a scenario that involved the use of proprietary algorithms and confidential client data within the test's simulated environment. The candidate is aware that the disclosure or misuse of such information could have significant legal and competitive implications for Globant. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical guidelines expected of a Globant candidate? Option A. Immediately cease engagement with the test and report the presence of proprietary and confidential information to the Globant legal and compliance departments, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Option B. Continue with the assessment, attempting to leverage the understanding of the proprietary algorithms and confidential data to provide the most comprehensive answers possible, assuming the test environment is secure. Option C. Proceed with the assessment and, upon completion, send a separate email to the hiring manager detailing the proprietary algorithms and confidential data encountered, highlighting their potential value. Option D. Discreetly document the proprietary algorithms and confidential data for personal reference and future professional development without disclosing it to anyone. The correct answer is A. Immediately cease engagement with the test and report the presence of proprietary and confidential information to the Globant legal and compliance departments, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Globant, as a technology services company, operates in a highly regulated environment where data privacy and intellectual property are paramount. The hiring assessment test is designed to evaluate a candidate's understanding of these critical areas and their ability to apply relevant regulatory principles. The challenge lies in discerning the appropriate course of action when faced with potentially sensitive information that could impact the company's compliance and competitive standing. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for thorough assessment with the obligation to protect proprietary information and adhere to legal frameworks. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent communication strategy that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This approach recognizes that the assessment process itself must be conducted within the bounds of applicable laws and company policies. By immediately escalating the concern to the appropriate internal stakeholders, such as the legal or compliance department, the candidate demonstrates an understanding of their responsibilities and a commitment to upholding Globant's integrity. This ensures that any potential issues are addressed through established channels, minimizing risk and maintaining a secure and compliant hiring process. The regulatory justification stems from the general principles of data protection and intellectual property rights, which require organizations to safeguard sensitive information and prevent unauthorized disclosure or use. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the sensitive nature of the information, or to attempt to use it for personal gain, or to impress the assessors without proper authorization. This would constitute a breach of confidentiality and potentially violate data privacy regulations, leading to severe legal and reputational consequences for both the individual and Globant. Another incorrect approach would be to directly disclose the sensitive information to the assessors without understanding the full implications or without following established protocols. This could inadvertently lead to a breach of confidentiality or a violation of intellectual property rights, even if the intention was to demonstrate knowledge. Such actions would undermine the integrity of the hiring process and expose Globant to unnecessary risks. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that emphasizes ethical considerations, regulatory adherence, and clear communication. When encountering potentially sensitive information during an assessment, the first step should be to identify the nature of the information and its potential implications. The next step is to consult internal policies and procedures regarding the handling of such information. If uncertainty exists, or if the information appears to be of a sensitive or proprietary nature, the professional decision-making process dictates immediate escalation to the designated internal authority, such as a supervisor, legal counsel, or compliance officer. This ensures that the situation is managed appropriately, in accordance with all applicable laws and company guidelines, and protects the interests of all parties involved. Question 14. What factors determine the appropriate course of action for a Globant employee when faced with a situation where a client's request for candidate evaluation appears to conflict with the established procedures of the Globant hiring assessment test? Option A. Strict adherence to the Globant hiring assessment test's regulatory framework and guidelines, prioritizing the integrity and fairness of the assessment process. Option B. Prioritizing the client's specific requests and expectations to ensure client satisfaction, even if it means deviating from the assessment's standard procedures. Option C. Expediting the assessment process by selectively applying or bypassing certain steps to meet perceived time pressures or client demands. Option D. Focusing on the candidate's overall perceived potential and experience, using the assessment as a secondary reference point rather than a definitive guide. Correct answer is A. Strict adherence to the Globant hiring assessment tests regulatory framework and guidelines, prioritizing the integrity and fairness of the assessment process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Globant employee tasked with ensuring compliance with the Globant hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. The challenge lies in navigating potential conflicts between client expectations and the internal guidelines of the assessment. A Globant employee must exercise careful judgment to uphold the integrity of the hiring process, while also meeting the specific requirements of the assessment, which are designed to evaluate candidates fairly and consistently. Misinterpreting or disregarding these guidelines can lead to an invalid assessment, unfair evaluation of candidates, and potential reputational damage for Globant. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to the Globant hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework and guidelines. This is paramount because the assessment is designed to be a standardized and objective measure of a candidate's suitability. Following these guidelines ensures that all candidates are evaluated under the same conditions, preventing bias and promoting fairness. This approach aligns with the ethical obligation to conduct hiring processes with integrity and professionalism, as expected of a Globant employee. The assessment's framework is the governing document for this specific evaluation, and any deviation would undermine its purpose. Incorrect approaches analysis. Prioritizing client requests over the assessment's guidelines is an incorrect approach. While client satisfaction is important, it cannot supersede the fundamental requirements of a standardized assessment designed for objective evaluation. This failure would violate the integrity of the hiring process, potentially leading to the selection of unsuitable candidates or the disqualification of qualified ones based on arbitrary criteria. It also risks creating an uneven playing field for candidates. Focusing solely on the candidate's perceived potential without strict adherence to the assessment's criteria is also incorrect. While intuition plays a role in hiring, the assessment is specifically designed to provide objective data points. Deviating from these criteria means the assessment's purpose is not being fulfilled, and decisions are being made on subjective grounds rather than the established evaluation metrics. This can lead to biased outcomes and a failure to identify candidates who truly meet the defined requirements. Ignoring the assessment's guidelines due to time constraints is a critical failure. The time allocated for the assessment is intended to ensure thoroughness and fairness. Rushing through or skipping steps compromises the validity of the evaluation. This approach demonstrates a lack of professional discipline and a disregard for the importance of a robust and compliant hiring process, potentially leading to significant errors in candidate selection. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Globant should approach such situations by first thoroughly understanding the specific requirements and constraints of the Globant hiring assessment test. When faced with conflicting demands or pressures, the primary responsibility is to uphold the integrity and fairness of the assessment process as defined by its internal guidelines. This involves clearly communicating the assessment's requirements to all stakeholders, including clients, and explaining why adherence is non-negotiable for a valid and equitable evaluation. If there are ambiguities or perceived limitations in the assessment framework, the professional course of action is to seek clarification from the assessment's administrators or relevant internal compliance teams, rather than making unilateral decisions that could compromise the process. Question 15. Benchmark analysis indicates that Globant employees participating in the Globant hiring assessment test must strictly adhere to the specified regulatory framework. If the assessment's jurisdiction is explicitly stated as U.S. regulations, which of the following approaches best demonstrates professional adherence to the assessment's requirements? Option A. Blending principles from both U.S. and Australian regulatory frameworks to offer a comprehensive understanding. Option B. Referencing only U.S. regulatory frameworks and guidelines, ensuring no other jurisdictions or generic terms are introduced. Option C. Incorporating relevant aspects of UK/CISI regulations alongside U.S. frameworks to provide a broader perspective. Option D. Utilizing general principles of financial regulation, without specific reference to the U.S. framework. The correct answer is B, referencing only U.S. regulatory frameworks and guidelines, ensuring no other jurisdictions or generic terms are introduced. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for Globant employees due to the inherent conflict between client demands and regulatory compliance. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to meet client expectations, which are often driven by commercial pressures, with the absolute requirement to adhere to the specific regulatory framework governing the Globant hiring assessment test. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to severe consequences, including invalidating the assessment, potential disciplinary action, and damage to Globant's reputation. Careful judgment is required to prioritize the integrity of the assessment process over immediate client satisfaction. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the specified regulatory framework for the Globant hiring assessment test, which mandates a singular jurisdictional focus. This means that if the exam specifies U.S. regulations, only U.S. frameworks should be referenced, and no other jurisdictions or generic terms should be introduced. This approach is professionally sound because it directly aligns with the explicit instructions and constraints of the assessment, ensuring that the candidate demonstrates an understanding of the required knowledge base without introducing extraneous or conflicting information. It upholds the integrity of the evaluation process and the validity of the results. An incorrect approach would be to reference UK/CISI regulations when the exam jurisdiction is U.S. This demonstrates a failure to understand and apply the specific requirements of the assessment, introducing irrelevant and potentially contradictory information. Ethically, it suggests a lack of attention to detail and an inability to follow instructions precisely, which are critical professional competencies. Another incorrect approach would be to combine U.S. and Australian regulatory frameworks. This violates the strict jurisdictional compliance requirement, creating a confused and non-compliant response. Professionally, this indicates a fundamental misunderstanding of the need for focused, jurisdiction-specific knowledge and an inability to operate within defined parameters. A further incorrect approach would be to use generic regulatory terms without referencing the specific U.S. framework. While seemingly less egregious than referencing another jurisdiction, it still fails to meet the requirement for specific adherence. It suggests a superficial understanding rather than a deep engagement with the mandated regulatory context. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough understanding of all explicit constraints and requirements of the task, particularly those related to jurisdiction and scope. Professionals must then critically evaluate each potential action against these requirements, prioritizing strict compliance. When faced with conflicting pressures, such as client demands versus regulatory mandates, the professional obligation to adhere to the established framework must take precedence. This involves clear communication with stakeholders about the limitations imposed by the regulatory environment. Question 16. The monitoring system demonstrates that a Globant financial advisor has received a request from a client to invest in a product that, while potentially appealing to the client's stated short-term goals, appears to fall outside the scope of products permitted by the regulatory framework and guidelines specified for the Globant hiring assessment test due to its inherent risks and lack of transparency. The advisor is aware of the client's preference, but also of the potential regulatory noncompliance. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Globant financial advisor in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the client's requested investment, assuming the client understands and accepts the associated risks and potential regulatory implications. Option B. Execute the investment as requested but immediately report the potential regulatory breach to the compliance department for guidance. Option C. Decline the client's request and inform them that the investment cannot be made due to regulatory restrictions, offering alternative, compliant investment options that align with their goals. Option D. Advise the client to seek independent legal counsel to navigate the regulatory complexities before proceeding with the investment. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the client's requested investment, assuming the client understands and accepts the associated risks and potential regulatory implications. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for a conflict between a client's stated preferences and the regulatory requirements governing financial advice. Globant, as a firm, has a responsibility to ensure that its employees adhere to all applicable regulations, which in this case would be the regulatory framework and guidelines specified for the Globant hiring assessment test. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the firm's duty of care and compliance obligations. A professional must exercise careful judgment to navigate this tension without compromising ethical standards or legal requirements. The correct approach involves prioritizing regulatory compliance and client best interests above a client's potentially misinformed or detrimental preferences. This means that the advisor must first identify the discrepancy between the client's request and the regulatory framework. Then, they must engage in a thorough discussion with the client, explaining the regulatory constraints and the rationale behind them, and demonstrating how adhering to the regulations ultimately serves the client's long-term financial well-being. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant because it upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty, ensures transparency, and prevents the firm from facilitating non-compliant or potentially harmful actions. The regulatory framework for the Globant hiring assessment test likely emphasizes principles such as suitability, client protection, and adherence to established investment standards. An incorrect approach would be to blindly follow the client's instructions without considering the regulatory implications. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the established rules. Such an action could lead to regulatory breaches, fines, reputational damage for both the advisor and Globant, and potential harm to the client if their instructions are not in their best interest or violate regulatory mandates. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand their reasoning or educate them on the regulatory landscape. This demonstrates poor client relationship management and a failure to fulfill the advisor's role in guiding clients towards sound financial decisions within the legal and ethical boundaries. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a structured approach. First, identify the core issue and any potential conflicts. Second, consult the relevant regulatory framework and internal firm policies. Third, assess the implications of different courses of action against these guidelines. Fourth, engage in open and honest communication with the client, explaining the situation and potential solutions. Finally, document all decisions and communications thoroughly. This systematic process ensures that actions are both compliant and client-centric, fostering trust and mitigating risks. Question 17. Quality control measures reveal that a recent project at Globant may have inadvertently exposed sensitive client data due to an oversight in access control configurations. The project team is concerned about the potential impact on the client and Globant's reputation. Option A. Focus on implementing a technical patch to fix the access control issue and assume the exposure was minimal and contained, deferring any client communication or formal investigation. Option B. Instruct the project team to immediately delete all potentially exposed data to prevent further access without consulting legal or compliance. Option C. Inform only the direct client contact about the potential exposure and assure them it has been resolved without a formal internal investigation or involving Globant's legal and compliance departments. Option D. Immediately initiate a comprehensive internal investigation involving legal and compliance teams to assess the extent of the exposure, identify affected data, and determine the appropriate regulatory response, while also informing the client proactively and transparently. The correct answer is D. Immediately initiate a comprehensive internal investigation involving legal and compliance teams to assess the extent of the exposure, identify affected data, and determine the appropriate regulatory response, while also informing the client proactively and transparently. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate operational needs with its long-term ethical and regulatory obligations. Globant, as a global technology services company, operates within a complex web of data privacy regulations. The challenge lies in identifying and mitigating potential breaches of these regulations without unduly hindering business operations or client relationships. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed solution is not only effective in addressing the immediate issue, but also compliant with all applicable laws and ethical standards. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented investigation that prioritizes data privacy and regulatory compliance. This means engaging the appropriate internal stakeholders, including legal and compliance teams, to assess the scope of the potential breach, identify the affected data types, and determine the specific regulatory frameworks, e.g., GDPR, CCPA, or other relevant local laws that apply. The subsequent actions must be guided by these legal and ethical requirements, focusing on containment, notification, if mandated, and remediation to prevent future occurrences. This approach upholds Globant's commitment to data protection and builds trust with clients and regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach that involves immediate deletion of data without proper assessment risks destroying crucial evidence, potentially violating data retention policies, and failing to meet regulatory notification requirements. This could lead to significant fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, such as informing only the immediate project manager without escalating to legal and compliance, bypasses essential oversight and expertise, increasing the risk of non-compliance and inadequate response. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on technical fixes without considering the legal and ethical implications of data handling and client notification would be insufficient and potentially harmful. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with identifying the problem and its potential impact. This is followed by gathering all relevant information, consulting with subject matter experts, legal, compliance, IT security, evaluating potential solutions against regulatory requirements and ethical principles, selecting the most compliant and effective solution, and finally, implementing and monitoring the chosen course of action. This systematic process ensures that decisions are well-informed, defensible, and aligned with organizational values and legal obligations. Question 18. Quality control measures reveal a potential gap in Globant's data handling procedures for a critical client project, which could inadvertently expose sensitive client information if not addressed. The project deadline is rapidly approaching, and the development team is under pressure to deliver. Option A. Instruct the development team to proceed with the project while simultaneously attempting to patch the identified data handling gap without formal escalation, assuming it is a minor issue. Option B. Immediately halt all data processing related to the project and escalate the identified gap to Globant's legal and compliance departments for immediate review and guidance before proceeding. Option C. Inform the client about the potential gap and seek their approval to proceed with the project while the issue is being investigated internally. Option D. Continue with the project as planned, documenting the identified gap for a post-project review, and rely on existing general security protocols to mitigate any immediate risks. The correct answer is B. Immediately halt all data processing related to the project and escalate the identified gap to Globant's legal and compliance departments for immediate review and guidance before proceeding. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate operational needs with its long-term ethical and regulatory obligations. Globant, as a technology services company, operates in a highly regulated environment where data privacy and security are paramount. The pressure to deliver a project on time, coupled with the discovery of a potential compliance gap, creates a conflict between expediency and adherence to established protocols. Careful judgment is required to ensure that short-term project goals do not compromise the company's integrity, client trust, and legal standing. The correct approach involves a structured, transparent, and risk-averse response. This means immediately escalating the issue to the appropriate internal stakeholders, such as the legal and compliance departments, and halting any further processing of sensitive data until the gap is understood and rectified. This approach is ethically sound and aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate robust data protection and incident reporting. It prioritizes compliance and risk mitigation over immediate project delivery, demonstrating a commitment to responsible business practices. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the project without addressing the identified gap, perhaps by assuming it's a minor issue or that it can be fixed later. This carries significant regulatory and ethical risks. It could lead to breaches of data privacy laws, resulting in substantial fines, reputational damage, and loss of client confidence. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to fix the issue internally without involving the designated compliance and legal teams. This bypasses established governance procedures, potentially leading to an inadequate or even counterproductive solution, and could be seen as an attempt to conceal the issue, which is ethically reprehensible and often a violation of regulatory requirements for transparency. Professionals facing similar situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This framework typically involves 1. Identifying the core issue and its potential impact. 2. Consulting relevant internal policies, procedures, and regulatory guidelines. 3. Escalating the issue to the appropriate subject matter experts, e.g., legal, compliance, security. 4. Documenting all actions and communications. 5. Implementing a solution that addresses the root cause while adhering to all applicable laws and ethical standards. The ultimate goal is to make decisions that are not only effective for the business, but also responsible and compliant. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows that a Globant client, operating in a sector with stringent data privacy requirements, has requested access to raw, unaggregated customer data that Globant is processing on their behalf. The client believes this direct access is necessary for their internal analytics team to identify emerging market trends. Globant's internal policies and common industry best practices emphasize data minimization and anonymization where possible to protect customer privacy. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible and compliant course of action for the Globant team? Option A. Inform the client that Globant cannot fulfill the request due to internal policies and suggest they find another vendor who can provide the required raw data access. Option B. Grant the client's request for raw data access immediately to ensure client satisfaction and avoid potential disputes, assuming the client will handle the data responsibly. Option C. Attempt to fulfill the request by providing the raw data, but instruct the client's team to be extremely careful with it, without implementing any additional security measures or data anonymization on Globant's end. Option D. Politely decline the request, citing data privacy concerns and Globant's commitment to data minimization, and offer to provide aggregated or anonymized insights derived from the data that address the client's analytical needs. The correct answer is D. Politely decline the request, citing data privacy concerns and Globant's commitment to data minimization, and offer to provide aggregated or anonymized insights derived from the data that address the client's analytical needs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Globant employee due to the inherent conflict between a client's request and the company's ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The need for careful judgment arises from balancing client satisfaction with the imperative to uphold data privacy and security standards, which are critical in the technology consulting sector. Globant, as a service provider, must navigate these demands without compromising its integrity or exposing itself and its clients to legal repercussions. The correct approach involves a transparent and collaborative discussion with the client. This entails clearly explaining Globant's data handling policies, the regulatory constraints, such as GDPR or similar frameworks if applicable to the client's data jurisdiction. Though for this exam, we assume a generic best practice aligned with common data protection principles, and the technical limitations or security risks associated with the client's request. The goal is to find an alternative solution that meets the client's underlying business need without violating privacy or security protocols. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes ethical conduct, regulatory adherence, and long-term client trust by fostering open communication and demonstrating a commitment to responsible data management. An incorrect approach would be to immediately accede to the client's request without proper due diligence. This failure stems from a lack of understanding or disregard for data privacy regulations and ethical principles. Such an action could lead to data breaches, unauthorized access, or misuse of sensitive information, resulting in significant legal penalties, reputational damage for both Globant and the client, and a loss of client confidence. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand the business rationale or explore alternative solutions. Maintaining compliance is paramount. A complete refusal without offering any constructive alternatives can damage the client relationship and be perceived as uncooperative. This approach fails to demonstrate a commitment to client partnership and problem solving. A third incorrect approach might involve attempting to fulfill the request by circumventing established security protocols or by making assumptions about data anonymization without proper validation. This is ethically unsound and legally risky, as it creates vulnerabilities and could lead to inadvertent data exposure, even if the intention is to be helpful. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly understand the client's request and its underlying business objective. Second, assess the request against Globant's internal policies, ethical guidelines, and relevant regulatory frameworks. Third, identify any potential conflicts or risks. Fourth, if risks are identified, engage in open and honest communication with the client to explain the concerns and explore mutually agreeable, compliant alternatives. Finally, document all discussions and decisions to ensure accountability and transparency. Question 20. System analysis indicates that Globant is considering onboarding a new client whose proposed operational model for data processing may present novel regulatory challenges under the relevant data protection frameworks. The sales team is eager to secure this significant contract. Which of the following approaches best aligns with Globant's commitment to regulatory compliance and risk management? Option A. Proceed with onboarding the client immediately to capitalize on the business opportunity, assuming the client's internal compliance processes are adequate. Option B. Inform the client that Globant cannot engage due to potential regulatory complexities without first conducting an internal review of the specific challenges. Option C. Conduct a thorough risk assessment to identify potential regulatory noncompliance. Evaluate the severity of any identified risks and develop specific mitigation strategies before proceeding with onboarding. Option D. Delegate the decision to the sales team, trusting their judgment on the client's suitability and regulatory adherence. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough risk assessment to identify potential regulatory noncompliance, evaluate the severity of any identified risks, and develop specific mitigation strategies before proceeding with onboarding. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Globant's compliance team as they must navigate the potential conflict between a new client's operational requirements and existing regulatory obligations. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to onboard a significant client, which has commercial implications for Globant, with the imperative to uphold regulatory standards and protect the company from legal and reputational risks. A hasty decision could lead to severe penalties, while an overly cautious approach might jeopardize a valuable business opportunity. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate risks effectively. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that prioritizes regulatory compliance. This means systematically identifying potential regulatory breaches associated with the client's proposed operations, evaluating the likelihood and impact of these breaches, and developing mitigation strategies. This approach is ethically sound and legally defensible because it demonstrates Globant's commitment to operating within the bounds of applicable laws and regulations. It proactively addresses potential issues, thereby safeguarding the company's integrity and reputation. This aligns with the principles of responsible business conduct expected of a global technology services company. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with onboarding the client without a thorough understanding of the regulatory implications. This is a failure of due diligence and a direct violation of the principle of regulatory adherence. It exposes Globant to significant legal penalties, fines, and reputational damage if the client's operations are found to be non-compliant. Another incorrect approach is to defer the decision entirely to the sales or business development team without involving the compliance department. This creates a siloed decision-making process that neglects critical risk management. Regulatory compliance is a cross-functional responsibility, and bypassing the compliance team's expertise is a significant ethical and operational lapse. A third incorrect approach is to assume that the client's internal compliance measures are sufficient without independent verification. While clients should have their own compliance frameworks, Globant, as a service provider, has a responsibility to ensure that its own operations and those it facilitates do not contravene regulations. This assumption can lead to overlooking critical gaps. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Globant should adopt a structured risk management framework. This involves 1. Identifying all relevant regulatory requirements applicable to the client's industry and the services Globant will provide. 2. Assessing the client's proposed operational model against these requirements, identifying any potential conflicts or gaps. 3. Quantifying the risks associated with any identified noncompliance, considering both financial and reputational impacts. 4. developing and implementing mitigation plans, which may include advising the client on necessary adjustments, establishing enhanced monitoring, or, in extreme cases, declining the engagement. This systematic process ensures that business decisions are informed by a robust understanding of regulatory obligation and potential risks.